Hey, what's up, everyone? I thought I would walk through the grocery store and talk about power violence. To be honest, it's so weird. I've been into that stuff since um, early 90s, To me, it was all hardcore punk. That's pretty much what it was. Just, I didn't even know about the term power violence. I would either just call it hardcore or just grindcore, which grindcore is pretty much, an outgrowth of hardcore punk. Bands, like a lot of bands did blast beats before that term was even coined. When you really think about it, it's just the fastest form of hardcore punk. It's almost like, but of course that they're, you read later. I mean, I read like later on that a lot of those bands were in the Celtic Frost and Slayer and all that. But earlier on, like blasting and stuff, specifically with a hardcore thing, we could talk about like how free jazz drummers and like a lot of drummers like Tony Williams blasted, but I'm just being a little bit more specific on this one. Pretty much like the blast beat was like the fastest beat, if anything, we gotta only thank Mick Harris from Napalm Death for actually coining the term grindcore and also the term blast beat. Whom I think he's still an amazing drummer. But when you think about power violence too, bands like No Comment, Infest, and all that. That was just like the last of the '80s hardcore. They're the ones who crossed it over into the '90s, pretty much. Me earlier on as a kid, I didn't even know that was like a subgenre. I just thought it was hardcore or thrash or grindcore. Thrash also is another term too, which initially was pretty much like a skating term, but more of a hardcore punk term too. That was used earlier on, with bands like Bad Brains and the Dead Kennedys, just for anything that was extremely fast. As far as like just the whole genre of hardcore, which I'm probably gonna end up doing a video about it, But those bands that like a lot of those bands that I heard were pretty much on college radio, like KSPC, KSPC and KXLU, those grindcore or power violence. It's almost like people are separating the movement. Now I could understand why people will make the difference, but at the same time, it's just they're all movements of the same hardcore punk genre. Like when you really think about it. Of course, there's been a bunch of different influences, especially, with a lot of power violence bands are, definitely a bit more experimental than your typical grindcore band. But it's not like, you had, I remember when Godflesh was considered grindcore. And although I understand it now, I understood it then, many people would not understand it now. People would just say that they're industrial. That was even a part of, grindcore too, because a lot of the influences that a lot of those bands were into the Swans and stuff like that. The Swans was a trippy band because they were kind of like that post-no wave, New York thing going on, but had a lot of kind of visceral industrial elements. Both genres were really experimental, if anything. So when I think of like a lot of these earlier groups, especially like No Comment and Infest, and to me they hold the same weight as a group like DRI or and even earlier like Bad Brains or MDC. They were just basically the groups that held on to playing extremely fast. You had DRI and Corrosion of Conformity getting a little bit more into the more heavy metal stuff and crossing over in that direction, whereas a lot of the grindcore bands pretty much like they pretty much were the last of that crossover movement, but they went totally on a whole different other extreme where they adopted the heaviness of even groups like Slayer or Possessed or any of those bands. And I'm sure it was all spontaneous, but they just totally basically like took that and added to, you know, the crazy hardcore punk stuff that they were doing and made it even more heavier and visceral. Plus that whole Swans element, you know, was just, you know, added as well. You know, I mean, all this stuff is pretty much spontaneous, but I'm just giving you basically kind of like how I saw it. You know, I'm not saying that it's like the overall. This is just coming from a dude that was kind of growing up listening to all this stuff, you know, back in the late 80s, early 90s and stuff. So, especially early 90s, man, you know, a lot of bands were really coming into their own, you know, or I don't know if that's fair to even say that, but yeah, shoot, a lot of punks, you know, I mean, shoot, I didn't see the whole grindcore thing as, you know, a lot of people would just look at it as metal, but that was more punk. Death metal was definitely metal, and you see how a lot of those scenes overlapped, you know, and I was into that too, but definitely grindcore was more of a hardcore punk thing and more visceral, more experimental, and at some point it got even just more heavier, you know, when you look at especially albums like Mentally Murdered and stuff, you know, and Enslaved to Obliteration, which was just down-tuned and just matte, you know, like, shoot, you know, some of the electro hippie stuff too, I mean, you know, and of course, the Carcass, you know, their whole grindcore, like gore grind fathers and all. I mean, now all these subgenres are here, but getting it back to power violence, you know, it's funny, even now, how I mentioned with the Godflesh thing, you know, you have power violence also, you know, bands like Dystopia, which to me they're just more sludge, but I don't know, I mean, it's just kind of like, you know, Black Flag kind of did the slow hardcore thing, groups like Blast, but these guys are definitely on some really sludge core, near like kind of doomy type stuff, you know, like you know, and then you have bands like Despise You, you know, like, you know, like I said, I didn't know about the term power violence before a certain time. I just looked at it all as hardcore punk, you know, or you know, some of it is like grindcore, but just even more so hardcore punk, you know, like, if anything, you know, and a lot of those bands have that background, and just, that's what they were into, and I'm sure they were into all kinds of different stuff, but that's just what I got from it, you know, like being a kid, being into that, you know. I was actually in a band with a guy from the first version of Flesh Parade called Fly Swatter, and you know, a lot of those bands influenced, you know, my drumming, you know, aside from a lot of the death metal stuff that I was listening to. I dug on bands like Stapled Shut, Despise You, of course No Comment, you know, many other hardcore bands that probably, and then here we go again, you know, like, would we say something like Citizen's Arrest would be considered power violence because of when it came out? Or was that just a West Coast thing? You know, I mean, there's so many bands that were playing like just really fast around that time as well, and it was amazing, you know. Hey, what's up? And just, I don't know, man. So it was like basically just extremely fast, loud, visceral hardcore punk, you know. I'm not saying that my word is the end all be all to it, but that's just some ranting, you know. If you guys are down to comment and subscribe or whatever, and just, you know, give me your opinions and your take on the whole power violence thing. You know, I was a punk rocker into all that stuff. I liked a lot of old punk, but that was like the closest to the most visceral thing, you know, hard, loud, and fast that, you know, I could find when I was like in my teens and stuff. The closest to the newest form of hardcore, although a lot of people might argue, and you know, for me, hardcore will always be loud, hard, fast, and just crazy, chaotic, and abrasive, you know. And you had a lot of these down-tempo bands that were playing them, but for me, the bands that I was into were those, you know, what was the power violence bands that a lot of people are talking about now. So yeah, hope to get your take. I'm still blasting, still grinding and having fun, you know, still into the same bands that I'm into, especially this one, Excruciating Terror. Yeah, have a great one. Peace to all you grinders out there, all you punk rockers, all you death metal blast beat fans, and anybody that's into like this kind of music. I'm sure, you know, you have your take on it, especially all you old school cats. Let me just, you know, school all these youngins and let us know what you think. Hopefully, I'm just giving you my perspective. Peace.